The morning sun was just beginning to warm the streets when Thomas Avery stepped off the bus and slowly made his way toward the bank. He moved with the careful rhythm of someone whose body had carried many years of effort, and though he relied on a cane, his steps were steady. His old service cap sat neatly on his head, slightly worn at the edges, but cared for with the quiet pride of someone who never forgot what it represented. Thomas wasn't the kind of man who complained. He wasn't the kind who raised his voice or made a fuss over small things. For most of his life, he had taken things as they came, dealt with them, and moved forward. But today, he found himself feeling a little nervous. He had been having trouble with a deposit that didn't show up in his account. His pension money was usually reliable, but this time it hadn't come through. And while he knew things like this happened sometimes, he also knew he needed it sorted out soon. Bills waited for no one. He stood outside the bank for a moment, taking a slow breath before pushing through the glass doors. The bank lobby was already busy. People stood in a long line, chatting on phones, shifting in place, tapping their feet. The overhead lights felt too bright, and the hum of voices echoed sharply off the tiled floor. Thomas stepped inside quietly, looking around for a sign or someone who could help him. He didn't want to take up anyone's time. He just needed someone to explain why his money hadn't shown up yet. Something simple, hopefully. Something quick. He joined the line. It stretched almost to the entrance, but he didn't mind waiting. He had grown used to waiting for things: doctors, buses, the mail, appointments. Waiting didn't bother him. What bothered him was the rising worry in his chest. He hoped he hadn't filled out something wrong. Sometimes the forms at the bank confused him, and he would reread them several times, trying not to look lost. A young couple in front of him laughed loudly at something on a phone screen. Behind him, someone kept sighing in frustration every few minutes. But Thomas simply kept his place in line and stayed patient. The bank was busy. That was all. As the minutes passed, he shifted his weight from one leg to the other. Standing too long made his knees ache, but he didn't complain. Instead, he looked around, studying the posters on the walls and the small digital screen that displayed bank announcements. A few staff members walked past, moving quickly from one task to another. None of them made eye contact with him, but he didn't expect them to. They were busy, and he understood that. He had spent enough years around busy workplaces to know when people were overwhelmed. He reached the front of the line after nearly half an hour. The teller station finally opened up, and he stepped forward with a polite smile. The woman behind the counter looked young, maybe in her early 20s, with neatly tied hair and a fast way of typing on her computer. She greeted him with a routine. Next, the kind of greeting that came from habit rather than interest. "Good morning, ma'am," Thomas said softly. She nodded, but didn't look up. "Account number?" Thomas fumbled slightly as he pulled out his wallet. He kept his important papers tucked inside carefully, folded in a small envelope. His hands weren't as steady as they once were, and he hoped she wouldn't notice. He found the paper and slid it toward her. She typed for a moment, then paused. "What's the problem today?" "There was a deposit that should have shown up yesterday," he explained. "My monthly pension. It's usually there by the morning, but for some reason, it's not appearing in my account." She continued typing, brows pulling together. "It says here the deposit is still processing." Thomas leaned a little closer, trying to hear better. The lobby noise made it difficult. "I'm sorry. Could you repeat that?" She sighed, louder than necessary. "It's still processing," she repeated, slower but not kinder. "Oh," he said. "Do you know when it might finish?" "I just have a few bills coming up, and I want to be sure." "It'll process when it processes," she said, cutting him off. "We don't control that." Thomas blinked, unsure why his simple question caused such irritation. "I understand." I just wanted to know if there was anything wrong with the account. She shook her head, tapping her nails on the counter. Like I said, it's processing. If you keep checking your balance, you'll see when it posts. He nodded again, but he still didn't feel like he understood. Is there anyone I can talk to who might explain what's delaying it? Just so I know. The teller finally looked up at him, impatience clear on her face. Sir, there's nothing else to explain. You're holding up the line. If you keep asking the same thing, I'll have to get the manager. The customers behind him shifted, and he felt several eyes on his back. His cheeks warmed, not from anger, but from embarrassment. He hadn't meant to cause trouble. He just wanted clarity. I'm sorry, he said quietly. I'm only trying to... The teller stood up slightly and waved over someone across the room. Manager, can you come here? Thomas's heart sank. He hoped she wasn't calling them because of him. He didn't want any problems. He just didn't understand what he had done wrong. A man in a crisp shirt and tie walked over briskly. His expression was tight, as though dealing with complaints was the last thing he wanted to do. What seems to be the problem? He asked the teller. He's not understanding that there's nothing we can do. The deposit is processing, and he keeps asking the same questions. Thomas opened his mouth to explain, but the manager held up a hand before he could speak. Sir, if the deposit is processing, then that's all there is to it, the manager said, sounding more annoyed than informative. We can't speed it up. I understand that, Thomas said gently. I was only asking if someone could explain what caused the delay. It's usually very reliable. The manager crossed his arms. There doesn't need to be a cause. These things happen. If you keep pushing the issue, you'll have to step aside so we can assist other customers. Thomas felt smaller somehow, as if the ground beneath him had shifted. He didn't want to push anything. He just wanted to understand. But his attempts at explanation only seemed to make the situation worse. I'm sorry, he said again. I truly didn't mean to. Sir, the manager said sharply, if you're done, please move aside. You're blocking the line. The young teller already motioned to the next customer, who looked irritated at having been delayed. Thomas stepped back quickly, not wanting to inconvenience anyone else. But as he took a step to the side, he realized he still didn't know what to do next. Should he stay and ask someone else for help? Would that just upset them more? Should he leave without answers? He stood there for a moment, confused, the envelope of papers trembling slightly in his hand. The noise of the lobby seemed louder now. Every voice around him sounded rushed, sharp, impatient. He didn't expect help from everyone, but he hadn't expected to be treated like a problem, either. Not for something so simple. He looked around the room again, hoping anyone might give him a small bit of guidance. But everyone was busy, focused on their own tasks, eyes glued to phones, screens, or the ground. Thomas took another slow breath, steadying his heartbeat. He had handled far more stressful situations in his lifetime. This was just a misunderstanding. That was all. Maybe later in the day, the deposit would appear and everything would be fine. He just needed a moment to think. The manager spoke to him again. His tone clipped. Sir, if you're finished here, you need to step outside. We need space for other customers. The words hit him harder than they should have. Step outside. As if he were causing trouble. As if he were in the way. Thomas pressed his lips together, nodded faintly, and turned toward the exit. He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't want to make anything worse. He pushed through the doors and stepped out into the sunlight. For a moment he stood still, breathing slowly, letting the quiet outside wash over him. But even the calm street could not fully soften the sting of what had just happened. He had walked in expecting help. Instead, he walked out feeling invisible. He looked down at his papers again, then lifted his eyes to the street, unsure what to do next. He needed guidance, but he didn't know where to find it. And as he stood there on the sidewalk, trying to gather his thoughts, he had no idea that someone nearby had been watching the whole thing and that this person was about to change everything for him in a way he never expected. Thomas stayed on the sidewalk for a long moment, trying to steady his thoughts. The air outside felt cooler than before, and a light breeze moved past him, brushing the edges of his jacket. He held his papers close to his chest, almost as if they might fall apart if he loosened his grip. He didn't know what to do next. He didn't want to cause trouble for anyone inside, but he still didn't understand why things had gone so wrong. All he wanted was a little clarity, something simple to make sense of the situation. He sat down slowly on a nearby bench. His knees felt stiff, and the relief of sitting helped ease some of the aching in his legs. People moved around him in a steady flow, some chatting on phones, some carrying bags, some rushing without looking at anyone. He watched them with quiet eyes, taking in the normal busy pace of the world. A world that seemed to move faster every year. His mind wandered back to the teller's tone, the manager's impatience, the way they had spoken to him like he was a burden. He didn't understand why asking a question had bothered them so much. He had been respectful the entire time. He had waited patiently. He had spoken softly. He didn't know what he had done wrong. Maybe he had taken too long to explain. Maybe he had repeated himself without realizing it. His hearing wasn't as sharp as it once was. Sometimes he had to ask people to repeat things. Most didn't mind. But today, it seemed to set everything off in the wrong direction. He bowed his head a little, feeling the weight of it all. It wasn't anger he felt. It was something quieter, something that settled deep in his chest and made him feel smaller than usual. A kind of sadness mixed with confusion. As he sat there, he didn't notice the tall figure who had been standing near the curb, watching the scene play out from the moment Thomas had been escorted outside. The man was hard to miss: broad shoulders, impressive height, a presence that naturally drew attention. He wasn't trying to stare, but he had clearly seen enough to know something wasn't right. After a few quiet seconds, the tall man walked closer, his steps slow and steady. When he reached the bench, he spoke in a low, gentle voice. "Sir, are you all right?" Thomas looked up, blinking against the sunlight. He didn't recognize the man right away, though most people would have. But Thomas wasn't someone who kept up with television or sports or anything like that. He saw only a stranger with kind eyes and a familiar calm in his posture, something steady and grounded. Double quotes. "Oh," Thomas said quietly. Yes, I'm fine. Thank you." The man didn't seem convinced. "I saw what happened in there. You didn't look all right when they asked you to leave." Thomas felt his cheeks warm again at the memory. He shook his head gently. "I don't want to bother anyone with it. Just a misunderstanding, I suppose." The tall man sat down beside him, taking care to keep a comfortable distance. "Doesn't look like a misunderstanding to me," he said softly. "Looked like they didn't give you the chance to explain." Thomas lowered his eyes to his hands. "Maybe I wasn't clear. I try to be, but sometimes I don't hear things right. I didn't mean to take up their time." "You weren't taking up anyone's time," the man said. There was no anger in his tone, just steady assurance. "You were trying to figure out your own business. That's what they're there for." Thomas nodded slowly, but didn't respond. He didn't know what else to say. It felt strange, having someone defend him so quickly. Most people moved on without noticing things like this. "Do you want to tell me what happened?" The man asked. There was no pressure in the question. No expectation. Only an open invitation. That alone made Thomas exhale a little deeper. "Well," Thomas began, "I receive a pension each month. It usually shows up by early morning. But this time, it didn't. I thought maybe I did something wrong." so I came in to ask about it. I thought someone could explain why it was delayed." He paused, adjusting his papers. "But I suppose I asked too many questions." The tall man shook his head. "No, you didn't." Thomas gave a small, unsure smile. They seemed frustrated. "I didn't want to upset anyone." "You didn't upset them," the man replied gently. "They just weren't patient. That's on them, not you." Thomas looked back at the bank doors. People entered and exited without hesitation. No one noticed him sitting there. No one realized he had left without answers. "I'm just not used to things being so rushed," Thomas said softly. "Everything feels so fast now. People used to take time to help. At least, that's how I remember it." "You're right," the man said. "Some places still do. Some people still do. But not everyone." Thomas nodded again, letting the silence settle between them for a moment. There was something comforting about this stranger's calm presence. He didn't push, didn't pry, didn't judge. He simply listened. That alone felt like a kind of kindness Thomas hadn't experienced in a long while. After a moment, the man asked, "Do you need help getting your answer?" Thomas blinked. "Oh, no. I don't want to trouble you. You must be busy." "I have time," the man said with a gentle smile. "And you deserve to be treated with respect. If you didn't get that in there, then maybe we can fix that." Thomas didn't know how to respond at first. He didn't want to draw more attention to himself. He didn't want to make a fuss. But the sincerity in the man's voice was impossible to ignore. "I appreciate that," Thomas said quietly. "But I don't want anyone getting upset on my behalf." "Don't worry," the man said. "I'm not going to cause any trouble. I'm just going to talk to them. Sometimes people need a reminder to slow down and treat others right." Thomas looked at him closely for the first time. The man's demeanor was calm, but his confidence was unmistakable. He spoke with the ease of someone who had handled many situations before, someone who understood how to approach things with patience rather than pressure. "Why would you do that for me?" Thomas asked softly. The man shrugged modestly. "Because it's the right thing to do. And because I've seen people get brushed aside when they don't deserve it." "You weren't treated fairly." Thomas felt the smallest wave of comfort wash over him. Someone believed him. Someone understood, but he still hesitated. "I don't want them thinking I'm making complaints or pointing fingers." "They won't think that," the man assured him. "I'm not going to say anything that reflects badly on you. I'm just going to ask them to take another look at your situation." Thomas considered it. He didn't want embarrassment, but he also didn't want to go home without understanding what had happened to his deposit. And he certainly didn't want to come back tomorrow only to repeat the same experience. "All right," he said finally. "If you think it's all right." "It is," the man said warmly. "And I'll make sure they treat you properly." Thomas felt something shift in his chest, a small spark of relief, like a weight lifting just a little. He hadn't expected anyone to step in for him today. He had arrived alone and expected to handle everything alone. But now, for the first time since entering the bank, he felt a bit of hope. Maybe things could be made right. The man stood up slowly. "Why don't you stay here for a moment?" he suggested. "Let me go inside and talk to them. I don't want you getting stressed again." "That's very kind," Thomas said, rising to his feet with care. "But maybe I should be there too. I don't want to hide outside." "That's fair," the man said with a nod. "We'll walk in together." Thomas adjusted his grip on his cane, steadied himself, and fell into step beside the man. The tall figure moved with confidence, but without any hint of ego or showmanship. He simply carried himself like someone who knew how to stay calm, even in chaotic spaces. As they approached the bank doors again, Thomas took a slow breath. He wasn't sure what would happen next. He hoped there would be no confrontation. He hoped the staff wouldn't be upset to see him return. But he trusted the man beside him, trusted his voice, his steadiness, his sincerity. He didn't know it yet, but the man walking with him was someone many people admired. Someone known for his kindness as much as his achievements. Someone who didn't overlook moments like this. Someone who believed every person, no matter who they were, deserved respect. And as the two of them stepped back into the bank, the atmosphere inside was about to shift in a way that no one, especially the staff, expected. When Thomas and the tall man walked back into the bank, the difference in atmosphere was noticeable even before they reached the counter. A few people in line glanced up, their eyes widening just a little, when they recognized the tall figure walking beside the older man. Whispers spread quietly, the kind that moved through a room without anyone meaning to start them. But Thomas didn't notice any of that. His focus was on staying calm and standing steady. He held his papers a bit tighter, hoping things wouldn't turn into another confusing moment. He didn't want the staff to think he was returning to complain. He only wanted answers clear, simple ones. The tall man slowed his stride just enough to match Thomas's pace. A soft reassurance passed between them without words. When they reached the main counter area, the same teller from earlier noticed them. She froze for a moment, her eyes darting from Thomas to the man beside him. Her expression shifted quickly, though she tried to hide it. The manager wasn't far away, standing near a desk and sorting through a stack of printed forms. He didn't look up right away, but when he eventually turned, he stiffened slightly at the sight of them, especially the tall man, whose presence filled the space naturally. Thomas opened his mouth to speak, but the tall man gently raised a hand. "Let me handle this part," the man said quietly. Giving him a small, reassuring nod, Thomas nodded back. He trusted him, even if he didn't fully understand why someone he just met was being this kind. The tall man stepped forward, his voice steady but polite. "Excuse me," he said to the manager. "Could we talk for a moment?" The manager straightened, a look somewhere between surprise and caution crossing his face. "Of course," he said quickly. "How can I help you?" The tall man kept his tone calm, not raising his voice even slightly. "I was outside earlier," he said, "and I saw this gentleman being sent out without having his issue addressed. I want to understand what happened." The manager's eyes flickered uneasily. "Sir, we didn't send him out for no reason. He was confused about his deposit, and we explained what we could." He was slowing the line down, and the tall man raised his hand again, not in anger, but in quiet interruption. "He wasn't slowing anything down," he said firmly. "He was asking questions anyone would ask if their money didn't show up. He wasn't loud. He wasn't rude. He wasn't causing trouble." The manager swallowed hard. The teller behind the counter shifted her feet and looked down at her keyboard as though it suddenly needed cleaning. "I understand your point," the manager said, trying to sound composed. "But sometimes we deal with a high volume of customers, and we have to keep things moving." "And that's fine," the tall man replied. "But it doesn't mean you rush someone who needs help, especially someone who clearly needed a bit more patience." The tone wasn't harsh. There was no threat. But the message was clear, and every person in the lobby could feel it. A few customers pretended to look at their phones, but were obviously listening closely. Thomas stood behind them, shifting his weight gently. He didn't want anyone to feel attacked on his behalf. He didn't want to make a scene. But hearing someone speak up for him calmly, kindly sent a warm ripple of gratitude through him. The manager tried again. "Look, we didn't mean any disrespect. It was just a busy moment." "Busy moments aren't an excuse to treat people poorly," the tall man said. "You can be efficient without being dismissive." A quiet silence fell over the area. Even the people standing in line weren't moving as much anymore. They seemed to be absorbing the conversation. The tall man continued, his voice softening. This gentleman served his country for many years. He walks with a cane, but he waited patiently in line and simply wanted to understand why his deposit hadn't appeared. That's not too much to ask. The manager's confidence faded a little. His expression shifted into something that resembled regret. "I didn't know," he said quietly. "You didn't need to know," the tall man answered gently. "Everyone deserves respect, veteran or not." Those few words seemed to settle deeply in the manager's mind. His shoulders lowered, and he took a breath. "You're right," he finally said. "You're absolutely right." Thomas stepped forward a little, wanting to ease the tension. "I'm not angry," he said softly. "I just didn't understand the delay. That's all." The manager nodded, his voice calmer now. "I apologize for the way things were handled. Let's take a closer look at your account." The teller straightened in her seat, her earlier impatience replaced with a more careful expression. "Yes, sir," she said to Thomas gently. "We can take another look." The tall man stepped aside, allowing Thomas to move forward. But he stayed close, making sure everything remained comfortable. The teller pulled up Thomas's information again. This time, her tone held patience rather than frustration. "It looks like the deposit is pending because of a processing delay on the sender's end. Sometimes the pension system updates later than usual. It should appear by this afternoon." Thomas nodded slowly. "So nothing is wrong?" "No, nothing is wrong," she assured him. "It's just delayed." Thomas felt the knot of worry in his chest loosen. "Thank you," he said. The tall man placed a gentle hand on the counter. "See?" he said softly to Thomas. "Now you have your answer." Thomas smiled, feeling a quiet relief spread through him. But the conversation wasn't over. The manager stepped closer again, his voice sincere. "Sir," he said to Thomas, "I want to personally apologize for the way we spoke to you earlier. We should have handled it differently. I didn't take the time to understand what you needed. That wasn't fair to you." Thomas shook his head. "I didn't take it personally," he said gently. "Everyone has busy days." "That doesn't excuse it," the manager replied. "I'm sorry." The teller chimed in softly. "I'm sorry too. I should have been more patient." Thomas gave a quiet, forgiving smile. "Thank you. I appreciate that." The tall man didn't pressure anyone, didn't add anything harsh, didn't try to embarrass the staff. He simply nodded as if acknowledging that the apology mattered. And that was enough. One of the customers in line called out softly, "That's how it should be handled." Another nodded in agreement. The bank lobby felt different now. Lighter, more human. The tall man turned to Thomas. "Is there anything else you need help with?" Thomas looked around, then shook his head. "No, I think that's everything." "I'm grateful for your help." "You're very welcome," the man said with a warm smile. "You deserve to be treated right." As they walked away from the counter, Thomas felt a mixture of relief and gratitude he hadn't expected to feel. When he first stepped off the bus that morning, when they reached the doors, the tall man pushed one open and let Thomas step out first. Outside, the sunlight had shifted slightly, casting a soft glow on the sidewalk. The cool air brushed past them again, but this time it felt refreshing rather than heavy. Thomas turned to the man. "I don't know how to thank you," he said quietly. "You didn't have to do that." "I know," the man said, "but sometimes stepping in is the right thing to do. We all need someone in our corner once in a while." Thomas nodded, feeling emotional in a quiet, controlled way. "You're very kind." The tall man smiled. "You deserve kindness." They stood there for a moment, watching people move along the street, each person occupied with their own lives, their own thoughts. "Do you need a ride home?" the tall man asked. Thomas shook his head. "No, I can take the bus. It's just a few blocks away." "Let me walk with you," the man said. "If you don't mind." Thomas didn't mind at all. They walked side by side, slowly, at Thomas's pace. People who passed them on the sidewalk often looked up in surprise when they recognized the tall man. But he simply nodded politely and kept walking, giving his full attention to the older gentleman beside him. As they reached the bus stop, Thomas found a seat on the bench. The tall man leaned against the pole, relaxed but alert. "You know," Thomas said with a soft smile, "I still haven't asked your name." The tall man chuckled lightly. "It's Shaq," he said. "Shaquille." Thomas blinked. The name clicked, though slowly. He had heard it before on televisions in waiting rooms, in conversations among younger folks, in stories about charity and sports. But he had never imagined meeting him like this. "Well," Thomas said warmly, "it's an honor." Shaq smiled back. "The honor's mine." The bus approached in the distance, its engine growing louder. "You take care of yourself," Shaq said, his voice gentle. "And if anything like this ever happens again, don't be afraid to speak up. People will listen. And if they don't," he added with a small grin, "I will." Thomas laughed softly, a warm, grateful sound. "Thank you, truly." The bus pulled up, and the doors opened with a squeak. Thomas stood slowly, steadying himself with his cane. Shaq stepped forward and gave his shoulder a gentle, supportive touch. "Have a good rest of your day." "You too," Thomas said. He climbed onto the bus, found a window seat, and looked out. Shaq lifted a hand in a small wave. Thomas waved back before the bus pulled away as the city rolled by outside. Thomas felt different, lighter, stronger, not because someone stepped in for him, but because he felt seen again, respected again, and that feeling stayed with him long after the bus turned the corner. The ride back to town felt longer than usual, even though the bus followed the same familiar road. Thomas sat by the window, his hands resting on his cane, his thoughts drifting back and forth between what had happened at the bank and what came next. He didn't like being the center of attention, and he surely didn't like the idea of anyone causing trouble on his behalf. He had lived his life quietly, respectfully, and he believed in handling problems calmly. But now it seemed that everything around him was moving faster, louder, and more complicated than he was ready for. Across the bus aisle, Big Shaq sat with his cap pulled low, looking out the opposite window. For someone with such a strong presence, he had a surprising stillness about him. He didn't fidget, didn't check his phone, didn't tap his foot like most people. He just sat there with a firm jaw, thinking deeply about something he hadn't shared yet. Thomas appreciated the silence. He didn't want to be fussed over. But at the same time, he couldn't shake the feeling that Shaq was carrying some sort of plan in his mind, something that might involve him, whether he liked it or not. When the bus reached the center of town, the two stepped off together. Shaq walked with slow, steady steps beside him, matching his pace almost too perfectly, as if he didn't want to rush ahead. It reminded Thomas a little of the young ones in his platoon many years ago, always trying to act tough, but staying close when things got uncertain. They stood on the sidewalk as the bus pulled away. The afternoon sun had softened by then, turning the streets golden. People walked past them in steady streams, on phones, holding cups, carrying grocery bags, mostly unaware of anything but their own errands. Life kept moving, just the way it always did. "You hungry, sir?" Shaq finally asked. Thomas looked up at him. "I'm all right. Don't you worry about me?" "I'm not worried," Shaq said. His voice had a calm weight to it. "Just making sure you're good." Thomas took a breath. "I appreciate it. I truly do. But I don't want you getting into anything because of today." "What happened?" "It was wrong, yes. But people make mistakes. Sometimes they don't even realize how they're coming across." Shaq looked down at him with a steady expression. "There's mistakes," he said quietly, "and then there's disrespect. Thomas didn't argue. He knew the difference. He just didn't want things to escalate. He had seen enough escalation in his lifetime. They started walking again, heading toward the small park near the town square. It was a peaceful place, with benches scattered around and a fountain in the middle. Families often sat there in the evenings. Older folks fed birds. Teenagers hung around the edges, laughing at something on their phones. It was ordinary, predictable, comforting, exactly what Thomas needed at that moment. They found an empty bench, and Thomas lowered himself onto it with care. Shaq sat beside him, elbows resting loosely on his knees. For a while, neither spoke. The fountain splashed gently. Children ran around the grass, and the breeze carried the smell of warm pavement mixed with leaves. Finally, Thomas broke the silence. "You know," he said slowly, "when I first joined the service, I was barely older than those kids running around over there. I didn't know much about the world. I thought I did, but I didn't." Shaq glanced at him, listening. "They teach you discipline, yes. They teach you how to protect yourself, how to work with others. But the main thing they teach you is how to remain calm, even when things are loud, even when people are angry, even when something isn't fair. You learn to take a breath, to think, to act carefully." Shaq nodded without speaking. Thomas continued. "What happened today? That young fellow at the bank. Maybe he was having a bad day. Maybe he misunderstood. Maybe he saw an old man and assumed I was confused. Or maybe he just wasn't taught better yet." He paused. "Either way, I don't want anyone getting in trouble because of me. I just want the issue fixed." Shaq leaned back against the bench. "You deserve respect," he said quietly, "especially after everything you've done in your life. People shouldn't talk to you the way that guy did. Shouldn't push you out like that." Thomas half smiled. "You remind me of someone I used to know. Always ready to stand up for others." Shaq didn't respond at first. He just stared ahead, his face unreadable. The sun sank lower behind the row of shops across the street, casting longer shadows. More families gathered in the park, and the sound of laughter grew around them. Thomas watched the scene with a gentle fondness. After a while, Shaq said, "Sir, there is something I need to tell you." Thomas turned to him. "What's that?" Shaq exhaled slowly. "I'm not done with the bank." Thomas stiffened a little. "Now listen." Shaq shook his head. "Nothing wild. Nothing loud. I'm not trying to start trouble. But what that staff did today, that's not going to slide. Not after the way he treated you. Some people need to be corrected before they treat someone else the same way." Thomas sighed softly. "I'm not saying what he did was right. I just don't want to see anger in return. Anger only grows more anger." Shaq looked at him with steady eyes. "Respect grows respect too." Thomas didn't know how to respond. It wasn't that Shaq was wrong. He just wasn't sure what the young man had planned. Before he could ask, Shaq stood up and looked down at him. "Do you trust me, sir?" Thomas took his time before answering. "I trust your intentions." Shaq nodded. "Then let me handle it. My way won't cause trouble, but it will make things right." Thomas studied the young man's face. There was no stubbornness there, no reckless spark. Instead, there was a quiet firmness, the kind that came from someone who had lived through enough to know what mattered. "All right," Thomas said reluctantly. "Just be careful. And be kind, even when being kind isn't easy." A small smile tugged at the corner of Shaq's mouth. "I can do that." He gave a respectful nod and began walking away. Thomas watched him go, his tall figure moving with purpose through the park's pathway until he disappeared behind the fountain. A strange mix of worry and hope settled in Thomas's chest. He didn't know exactly what Shaq planned to do, but he sensed that it was something measured, something thoughtful. something meant to help not harm. The sky darkened into a soft shade of evening blue. Street lights flickered on one by one, and families began packing up to go home. Thomas sat alone on the bench for a long time, letting the world slow down around him. He wasn't afraid, but he felt the weight of uncertainty hanging in the air. Eventually, he stood up and began his slow walk home. His steps were quiet, his thoughts quieter. He told himself that everything would be fine, that the young man he'd met today meant well, that tomorrow would bring clarity. But deep down, he also knew that when someone like Shaq made a promise, they intended to keep it, and whatever came next at that bank was already in motion. The next morning arrived quietly, with soft light touching the streets and a cool breeze moving through the neighborhood. Thomas woke earlier than usual, long before most people were up, partly because he hadn't slept well. His thoughts kept circling back to Shaq's promise, and though he tried to trust that everything would be handled calmly, a little knot of worry sat in his stomach. He brewed himself a cup of tea and sat at the small table near his window. The warm cup felt good between his palms, but it didn't ease the unsettled feeling. He kept thinking about the young staff member at the bank, the way the situation had spiraled, and how easily things could get out of hand if emotions ran too high. Thomas had spent much of his life trying to prevent unnecessary conflict. Now he felt like he might be sitting on the edge of one without knowing what direction it would go. Still, when he thought of Shaq, he remembered the calmness in the young man's voice and the careful promise he had made. That gave him a little comfort. Just enough to breathe. By mid-morning, Thomas decided he couldn't just sit around and wait. Doing nothing made him more anxious. So he got dressed, put on his old service cap, picked up his cane, and stepped outside. The air smelled fresh, the sky bright, and he walked slowly toward town, hoping the movement would clear his thoughts. Meanwhile, across town, the bank had just opened for the day. Staff members moved around the lobby, preparing their counters and gathering paperwork. The atmosphere felt normal at first, but that shifted when Shaq stepped through the glass doors. He didn't storm in or raise his voice. He walked in the same steady way he always did, quiet but unmistakably confident. A few people waiting in line glanced over, recognizing him as someone they'd seen around town before. Not famous, but memorable, Shaq didn't go to the line. Instead, he walked straight to the reception desk, where a woman greeted customers as they entered. She looked up at him with a polite but slightly startled expression. "Good morning," she said. "How can I help you today?" Shaq gave a small nod. "I'm here to speak with your branch manager." Her eyebrows lifted a little. "Do you have an appointment?" "No," he said calmly, "but he'll want to talk to me." The woman hesitated, unsure how to respond. She wasn't intimidated, but something about Shaq's tone made it clear that this wasn't a complaint to brush aside. She picked up the phone and called the manager's office. A few minutes later, the manager, a middle-aged man with a tidy haircut and the kind of posture that came from years of corporate training, stepped out. He looked around until his eyes settled on Shaq. "Good morning," the manager said, offering a professional smile. "I understand you wanted to speak with me?" "Yes," Shaq replied. "It's important." The manager gestured for him to follow. "All right, then. Let's step into my office." They walked through the glass door into a quiet room. The manager sat down behind his desk, folding his hands together. Shaq took the seat across from him, leaning back slightly, but keeping his eyes focused. "How can I help you?" The manager asked. Shaq didn't waste time. "Yesterday, one of your staff members treated an older gentleman with disrespect. Worse than disrespect, he pushed him out before listening, before checking his information, before showing any patience. That man is a veteran. He came here needing help, not trouble." The manager's face stiffened. He didn't look angry, but he looked concerned in a way that suggested he hadn't heard about the incident. "I see," he said carefully. "Do you know which staff member this was?" "Yes," Shaq answered. "The young guy at Station 3. I'm not here to make a scene or cause anyone to lose their job. But this needs to be addressed properly." The manager nodded slowly. "I appreciate you coming to me directly, and I'm sorry for what happened. We try our best to train our staff to treat everyone with respect, especially older clients who may need more guidance. If what you're saying is accurate, then this is clearly not acceptable." "It's accurate," Shaq said simply. The manager took a breath, then stood. "Please wait here just a moment." He stepped out of the office and spoke with someone outside. Shaq couldn't hear the words, but he could see the manager's serious expression through the frosted glass. A few minutes later, the young staff member from the day before entered the office. His face pale and uneasy. He closed the door behind him. The manager looked between the two men. "I called you here because we have an issue that needs discussing. This gentleman witnessed your behavior yesterday toward a client, an older man, who came in with a simple question. It seems you may have acted improperly." The staff member swallowed hard. "Sir, I didn't mean anything by it. I just thought he was confused. The line was long, and I was trying to keep things moving." "By pushing him out?" the manager asked. The young man shook his head quickly. "No, I didn't push well. I didn't think it was—" "You didn't listen to him," Shaq said quietly. "Not once." The room fell silent. The manager rested his hands on the desk. "This bank serves every member of this community, and we treat them with dignity. That includes patience. That includes respect, especially toward someone who served this country." The young staff member looked down at his shoes, his face red. "I understand," he said softly. "I'm really sorry." Shaq studied him for a moment. He wasn't looking for anger. He wasn't looking for fear, either. He was looking for something real, something that showed the young man learned from what happened. "What you did hurt him," Shaq said. "Not physically, but you made him feel small for asking for help." The young man's voice lowered. "I know. I shouldn't have talked to him like that." The manager nodded. "You will be given corrective training, and I expect you to apologize to him in person when he next visits." "Understood?" "Yes, sir," the young man said. Shaq didn't smile, but he softened a little. This was what he came for, not revenge, not punishment. Just acknowledgement. Just responsibility. After a few minutes, the staff member left the office, leaving Shaq alone with the manager. "I want to thank you," the manager said. "Not everyone would take the time to bring this directly to me. We want to do right by our customers." Shaq nodded. "Good, because that man deserves better." "I'd like to make sure his account issue is resolved immediately," the manager added. "If you can bring him in or let him know, we will handle it personally." Shaq stood. "I'll tell him." They shook hands, and Shaq walked out of the office with the same calmness he'd walked in with. There was no crowd waiting, no drama, no raised voices, just a quiet sense of balance settling back into place. As he stepped outside, the sunlight warmed his shoulders. And at that same moment, down the street, Thomas was just turning the corner, walking slowly with his cane, unaware that the conversation he had feared was already finished in the best way possible. Shaq spotted him from a distance and walked toward him. When Thomas saw him, he paused, the worry on his face easing just slightly. Shaq approached with a steady expression, not triumphant, not smug, just calm. "It's done," he said gently. Thomas let out a slow breath. "What exactly did you do?" "Talked," Shaq replied. "That's all." Thomas stared at him for a long moment, then nodded with deep relief. "Thank you, truly." They stood together on the sidewalk as people passed by, the day carrying on around them. Thomas felt lighter, like a weight he'd been holding for too long had finally shifted. And though he didn't know everything that would come next, he knew one thing for sure. Sometimes the right person steps in at just the right time, not with noise or force, but with steady, quiet strength. The morning after everything had been settled at the bank, the town felt calmer, quieter, as if the whole place had taken a breath. The sunlight stretched across the rooftops and slowly warmed the sidewalks. Thomas stepped outside his small home with a careful, steady step. His cane tapped lightly against the concrete. He wasn't rushing anywhere. He just wanted fresh air, maybe a quiet walk to ease his thoughts. His mind wasn't full of worry anymore, not the way it had been the days before. Instead, he felt something rare relief. It wasn't the loud kind, not the kind that made you cheer or laugh. It was gentle, like a soft pressure lifting from his chest. Still, he couldn't shake a small sense of disbelief. Things like this didn't normally happen to him. People usually passed him by, too busy or too distracted, to notice someone moving a little slower than the rest. But this time, someone had noticed. Someone had cared. As he walked toward the small park near his street, he spotted Shaq sitting on a bench, looking like he'd been waiting. Not impatiently, just present, calm, a tall figure sitting quietly with his elbows resting on his knees. Thomas smiled faintly. "You're out early." Shaq looked up and gave a small nod. "Wanted to check on you. Make sure you're all right." "I'm better than all right," Thomas replied. "You did a lot yesterday. More than most people would." Shaq shrugged slightly. "Sometimes folks just need someone to step in." "You deserve that." Thomas sat beside him, lowering himself carefully. A few birds hopped around on the grass, pecking at crumbs left from someone's late-night snack. Cars passed slowly on the nearby road, their engines humming softly. After a moment of quiet, Thomas said, "I went by the bank this morning. Didn't go in, just looked at it. Funny, isn't it? A building like that can hold so much stress for someone. But today, I don't feel any fear going back." "That's the idea," Shaq said. "And I heard you spoke for me," Thomas continued. "They told me you asked for my issue to be handled personally." Shaq nodded once. "They'll fix your account," the manager promised. He meant it. "I believe he did," Thomas said. But what meant more was seeing that young man outside afterward. He looked like he was thinking real hard about something. "He probably was," Shaq said. "He realized what happened wasn't right. He looked like he wanted to say something," Thomas added. "Didn't come up to me, but I could tell." "He'll get there," Shaq said. "People grow. Sometimes it takes a moment like that to wake them up." Thomas breathed in deeply, letting the cool air fill his lungs. "It's strange. When I was younger, I dealt with things head-on. These days, I try not to bother anyone. But every now and then, you need a reminder that you're still allowed to ask for kindness." Shaq leaned back against the bench. "You're not bothering anyone. You did nothing wrong. You just needed help. And you gave it," Thomas said. "More than I expected." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The town around them seemed to move gently, unhurried. A jogger passed by with a nod. A dog barked in the distance. The breeze carried the faint smell of fresh bread from a bakery down the road. Then Shaq said, "You know, after yesterday, a few folks asked me why I stepped in. They said something like, 'You didn't have to get involved.' And they're right. I didn't have to." Thomas turned his head slightly. "Then why did you?" Shaq looked at him, his expression sincere. "Because sometimes the world gets too fast, too impatient. People stop seeing each other. They look past the folks who need a little more time or a little more care. And then someone like you gets treated like you're in the way. I can't stand that. Not when someone has spent their whole life serving others." Thomas stared forward, the emotion building in his chest. That means more than you know. Shaq gave him a gentle pat on the shoulder. Just doing what's right. A small smile tugged at the corner of Thomas's mouth. You remind me of someone I knew back in the day. Same steady way of speaking. Same look in the eyes when things get serious. Hope that's a good thing, Shaq said with a slow grin. It is, Thomas replied. A very good thing. They both chuckled softly. After a while, Shaq asked, You got plans today? Thomas shook his head. Nothing big. Just taking the day slow. Well, Shaq said, standing up, how about breakfast? There's a little diner around the corner. Makes the best pancakes in town. My treat. Thomas raised an eyebrow. You don't have to feed me too. I know, Shaq replied. I want to. Thomas gently pushed himself to his feet. In that case, I won't say no. They began walking together down the sidewalk, side by side, at a steady pace. Shaq didn't rush him. He matched his steps the same way he always did. As they reached the diner, the bell above the door jingled. The place was busy but warm, filled with the smell of coffee and syrup. People glanced up when the two entered, not in judgment, not in curiosity, but with simple friendliness. They took a booth by the window. A waitress greeted them with a smile and poured coffee into waiting mugs. When she stepped away, Thomas looked out the window at the town he'd lived in for years. A place that sometimes made him feel invisible, but today he didn't feel invisible at all. He felt seen, heard, respected. While they waited for their food, a man walking past outside paused for a moment. He tapped on the glass softly, catching their attention. When Thomas looked up, he realized it was the same young bank employee from the other day, the one who had spoken to him harshly. The young man lifted a hand awkwardly, giving a small, respectful wave, more of a gesture of apology than anything else. He didn't enter the diner. He didn't interrupt. He just wanted to say something without words. Thomas looked back at him for a long moment, then lifted his hand in return. A small nod. A silent message that everything was forgiven. The young man nodded back, relieved, then walked away. Shaq watched the exchange with a quiet smile. Looks like he's learning. I think so, Thomas said. Everyone has room to grow. Their food arrived: warm pancakes, scrambled eggs, toast, the kind of breakfast that made the whole place smell like comfort. They ate slowly, talking about everything and nothing. Life, work, the small things that make days feel meaningful. By the time they finished, the sun was higher, the streets were busier, and the morning had fully settled in. Thomas felt lighter than he had in years. As they stepped out of the diner, Thomas looked at Shaq with a grateful expression. You know, young man, not many people would do what you did. Not many would take the time. Shaq shrugged modestly. Just being decent. That's all. No, Thomas said. It's more than that. You helped restore something I didn't realize I'd been losing. Faith. Faith in how people can treat one another. Shaq smiled gently. Glad I could help you find it again. They stood there on the sidewalk. Sunlight warming their shoulders, cars rolling by. The world feeling just a little kinder than it had the week before. Finally, Thomas said, Let's keep in touch. If you don't mind an old man's company once in a while. Shaq grinned. I'd like that. And so they walked down the street together. Two people from different generations, but connected by something simple and important: respect, kindness, and the kind of humanity that changes small moments into lasting ones. The town kept moving around them, but neither of them felt rushed. They simply walked, step by step, toward whatever the rest of the day would bring.